The America that entered the 1920s is, for the first time, recognizable to us now. Millions of automobiles occupied the streets and flowing streams, and people were moving about in their daily lives very much like the Americans of today. Indeed, from many sides, the technological revolution, keyed to mass consumption, was creating an essentially modern, urban way of living. Americans flocked to the movies. They listened to radios. The first television broadcast took place in 1927. And more than half of Americans lived in cities, many of which were very large metropolitan centers like New York. The scattered, loosely organized agricultural country of half a century before had been replaced by a United States of America tightly linked by railroad and automobile, beginning to use the airplane, alive with a buzzing network of telephone lines, and highly industrialized. Hard surface roads spread over the countryside with startling speed. City ways of life invaded the countryside. This pulling of the country together physically inaugurated a common national culture. It was a time of abandonment, abandoning old ways and entering a new age of values and attitudes. Anything goes was the watchword. From the newly liberated young women who broke away from society's traditional expectations by wearing short skirts, cutting their hair, smoking cigarettes, and wearing cosmetics, to the improvisational nature of America's original art form, jazz, a reckless artistic abandon that mirrored the changes in American society, to adventurers attempting the seemingly impossible, like Charles Lindbergh flying solo across the Atlantic Ocean. Anything goes. Experiment. This was a new age, a new way of thinking. No longer would Americans be tied to old methods of thinking, the reasoning went. That road had led to war and disillusionment and death. Abandonment. But abandonment has a second meaning as well. It means giving up or feeling lost. Some saw only an endless cycle of prosperity, but others saw dark clouds of racism and economic injustice on the horizon. And there was good reason to feel that way. In 1919 alone, 40 bombs were intercepted that were addressed to prominent Americans. 4 million workers went on strike, and race riots swept the United States. These conflicting visions were a primary characteristic of the 1920s. On the positive side, most saw the era as a time of hope and optimism, a belief that cut across all racial and economic strata. Symbolized by the spunky spirit of Betty Boop or Mickey Mouse, the comic anarchy of Charlie Chaplin, the freedom of Colleen Moore, the original flapper, the original liberated young woman, or fueled by the dream book of the Sears Roebuck catalog. Many Americans in the 1920s believed strongly in the ultimate triumph of American civilization. It was a time of optimism. During the decade, the country saw steady economic growth, low unemployment. Unemployment was only 3% in early 1929. Increased worker productivity, rising wages, and an improving standard of living. The use of indoor plumbing, hot water, central heating and air conditioning, and conveniences such as electric stoves, refrigerators, and vacuum cleaners all increased dramatically. For instance, the number of homes with electricity doubled during the 1920s. These were great days, it seemed. Herbert Hoover, Secretary of Commerce, declared his belief that he could soon see a day when poverty would be eliminated in America. To use the contemporary phrase, the 20s were roaring. It was a time of mobility. Annual automobile production rose from 2 million in 1920 to 5.5 million in 1929. By the end of the decade, 1 out of every 5 Americans had cars. A primitive public opinion poll of the period asked citizens to make a choice. Would you rather have a car or a bathtub? Overwhelmingly, Americans chose the car. Their reason? The most common response was, you can't drive a bathtub to town. The chief figure in this boom was Henry Ford, who became an icon for many. Ford's Model T cost about $290 brand new. That would be about $5,000 today, putting vehicular freedom in the range of every American. To keep costs low, Ford offered few options, though. He once famously said, "You can have your Ford any color you want, as long as it's black." Americans traveled by car and railroad. Vacations became more common. Traveling long distances were no longer a novelty. Moving your family for brighter opportunities elsewhere was no longer an unusual, unthinkable event. Move, dream, anything was possible, these enthusiasts promised. But a dark side existed also. It was a time of restriction as well. Prohibition, through the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, made it illegal to make or transport alcoholic beverages. In fact, anyone simply drinking a beer could be in jeopardy of violating the law. It was a government attempt to regulate behavior and morality. It led to gangland violence, which was not fully anticipated, but it also led to a sweeping reduction in alcohol consumption, just as it had planned. These contrasting results fit perfectly into the conflicting nature of the Roaring Twenties. There were restrictions in immigration as well. The National Origins Act of 1924 virtually ended all immigration from non-English-speaking countries. Most Asians were already prohibited from immigration by this time by such laws as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and those of Asian descent already in the United States were subjected to discriminatory laws. California's Alien Land Law of 1913 outlawed land ownership by people of Japanese ancestry, and federal laws barred Asian immigrants from obtaining citizenship. Asian American students were routinely denied admission into California's university system. For other ethnic groups, it was a time of despair. The Roaring Twenties saw a resurgence of the racist terrorist group, the Ku Klux Klan, spouting their hatred of blacks, Jews, immigrants, and Catholics behind a slogan proclaiming themselves to be, quote-unquote, 100% American. Membership in the organization rose from about 1,000 to more than 5 million during the decade. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Black America's leading civil rights society, documented frequent lynchings throughout the nation, sometimes as many as one or more per day. It was a time of fear. More than 1.5 million Mexicans immigrated legally to America in those days, looking for a better life, but they were routinely met with job and housing discrimination. As California agricultural laborers, they were victims of violence from competing laborers and strikebreakers. In the Imperial Valley in the late 1920s, strikes to improve farm worker conditions were brutally crushed, and their leaders were deported. Minorities were ghettoized and not allowed full assimilation into the dominant culture. But the dream persisted. This was America. Anything could happen in this new age. And even out of this suppression would come the remarkable. A wonderful example of this can be found in the 1920s African American literary, artistic, and intellectual movement called the Harlem Renaissance. Its essence was summed up by the critic and teacher Alain Locke in 1926, when he declared that through art, in his words, black life is seizing its first chances for group expression and self-determination. Harlem in New York became the center of a spiritual coming of age, transforming social disillusionment to race pride. The nucleus of the movement included many writers and artists. A few are shown here. There is the artist Archibald Motley with his colorful depiction of black life. The poet, novelist, and social activist Langston Hughes, who is the innovator of a form of writing called jazz poetry. In his most famous poem, he has these words about the black experience. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? And the novelist Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote the novel Their Eyes Were Watching God, which was named one of the 100 best novels of the 20th century. It was a time of change, both positive and negative. Women finally gained the hard-earned right to vote in national elections with the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, and more women than ever joined the workforce, about 15% of the female population. But they struggled through lack of promotions, unequal pay for equal work, and traditions that frowned on women's economic independence. Rapid modernization, frequent change affected young people as well. Trumpeted as the flaming youth who would set the world on fire, oftentimes the young became alienated in a culture that seemed unstable and unclear. They were, in the words of the famous author Ernest Hemingway, a lost generation. Economic warning signs were ignored as well in the wave of optimism. In the 1920s, 43% of annual incomes in America were under $1,500 a year, the equivalent to about $21,000 today. By 1929, more than 75% of all families had annual incomes under $2,500, roughly $35,000 today, considered a barely lower middle class income and only the loss of a paycheck or two away from destitution. In October 1929, change became crash as the stock market collapsed and helped usher in the worst economic disaster of the century, the Great Depression. Many on the economic fringes fell into the abyss. Unemployment reached 25%. Underemployment, which is having a job but not rising above the poverty line, was 50%. 273,000 families became homeless daily in the first years of the Depression. Anything goes, they said. In this case, what was gone was the feeling of hope. No doubt about it, the 1920s was a time. This new age, this jazz age, this roaring 20s. But in this dramatic time, which direction would American life take? Was it really true that anything goes?